One of my favorite things about the trains here in North America is how diverse they are, and one of the key differentiators between them is paint schemes. One such railroad who has a long storied history of diverse paint schemes is Amtrak, America's national passenger railroad. Today we'll be ranking most, if not all, of Amtrak's paint schemes. Ranking Amtrak's paint schemes. So just before I'm going to start, I'm going to say I am leaving out state-supported routes, and I'm probably going to miss a few other paint schemes just because I think the state-supported Amtrak routes are so far separated from Amtrak's national network at this point that they would deserve their own video or some sort of separate thing. I also just don't really feel like ranking them because a lot of them are not very outstanding. They're pretty basic for the most part. So yeah, let's begin. So the story begins not with Phase I, as many would think, but with a seldom recognized paint scheme that Amtrak has recently dubbed Day 1. It was originally painted on a E8 that was inherited from, I think, the Penn Central back in 1971 for Amtrak's first day of service, and I think it's a pretty solid paint scheme. I mean, it keeps the E8's original Penn Central black colors, but adds to it with a unique blue and white stripe, and I think it's pretty solid. A lot of people don't like the blue and the black together, but I think it looks pretty nice, and I'm glad it's gotten recognition recently with the ALC 42-301 that was painted in this paint scheme. With that said though, it's not very significant in the Amtrak history, so I'm going to give it a B. Then we'll get to the official Amtrak paint schemes, beginning with Phase I, Amtrak's first ever paint scheme. This scheme came about in the 70s, and you can kind of tell just by the color palette, very 70s, a lot of bright colors, an interesting pattern, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of silver on the side, which I don't like. I think from the front, Phase I looks pretty nice, but I don't like silver, and you'll come to see that later in the video. I'm not a big fan of silver for the most part. So I think that Phase I also is going to get a B, because I do like the red, and the Amtrak logo on the front that was just spelled out, I forget what the font was, but it was a very basic font, and I think it looks pretty nice. Next up we have Phase II, which is, I think, the most forgotten Amtrak paint scheme. It only lasted a few years, and it looks very similar to the paint scheme that came right after it, Phase III. I think on its own, it's a solid paint scheme. It's very nice, and if Phase III never came about, it would be incredibly iconic. But in context of the other Amtrak paint schemes, I just don't like it very much. The two stripes just kind of look awkward compared to the three. You know, rule of thirds, it's a thing, and the three looks better. So I think Phase II, it's going to get a C, because it's still a good paint scheme, and Phase III was incredibly iconic. So on to Phase III. Phase III is by far Amtrak's most iconic paint scheme. You know, it was debuted on the F40s, their most iconic locomotives. 1980s, it was a very cool paint scheme. Easy S tier, great look. But there were other versions of Phase III. So there was the Genesis locomotive Phase III, which looked a little different, actually a lot different. It was like a white/silver/gray and weird lines. It kind of looked a little like Phase IV. I don't like it at all. I'm going to give it a D. It's just not good. There's a lot of silver, and it's kind of busy. I don't like it. Speaking of busy, there is another Phase III paint scheme that's called Pepsi Can. Looks like an 80s Pepsi can. I actually really like this one just because the Dash 8 locomotives, they're very boxy, and this paint scheme fits them well. When they painted it onto a P42, I don't think it looks as good, but as a paint scheme applied to the Dash 8s, I'm going to give it a B. It looks pretty good, and it's very unique. Next up, Phase IV. Now I said I don't like silvers, but Phase IV is really cool. I think it's very like early 90s, and it gets an A for me. It's just, the blue is cool. It's kind of busy up front, but it's like very period correct, I think. Moving on, we have Amtrak's Phase V paint scheme, which debuted, I think, late 90s, early 2000s. I think it looked great in the era. A lot of silver, a lot of blue, very little red. They were doing away with the red, but I think it's overstayed its welcome. Like 20 years later, has it aged that well? Not really, but back when it debuted, it was cool, you know? And it's not retro yet, it's just tired. So I think Phase V gets a C. It's just, it's long past its prime. It needs to go. Luckily, it is starting to go. In 2020, Amtrak introduced Phase VI, which is a new interim paint scheme between Phase VII, which I'll cover in a minute, and Phase V. You know, they didn't have Phase VII done in time, but the ALC 42s were starting to be finished at Siemens, so they painted, I think, 10 of them or something like that, 9, into Phase VI. And I think Phase VI is one of Amtrak's best paint schemes ever. I think the vibrant colors bring Amtrak's design language into the 2020s, and at least from a railfan standpoint, I think that the chevron logo, the pointless arrow that pays homage to Phase I that's on the back of these locomotives, looks great. I think Phase 6 is my favorite Amtrak paint scheme thus far. Next up though is Phase 7, which is going to be painted onto the majority of Amtrak's next generation equipment, especially from Siemens. And I like it, I like the color palette, and it does modernize Amtrak's look quite a bit, but with that said, I'm not a huge fan of the weird swoop on the side. It looks like a mid-2000s Pepsi can to me, which now gives Amtrak two Pepsi can-esque paint schemes. I don't know what's up with that, but I don't like the swoop on the side, and I think the darker blue on the nose in Phase 7 doesn't look as good as the lighter blue on Phase 6. But with that said, it's still a great paint scheme, so I'm going to give it an A. Anyways, that gets us through all of Amtrak's conventional paint schemes, but they have a handful more that I'm going to cover in this video. First, I'll start with the Acelas, because, the Acelas are some of Amtrak's most recognized and iconic trains, so I feel like I should just cover them. The original paint scheme for the Acelas was very, very period correct for the very late 90s. A lot of silver, a lot of blue, very similar to Phase 5, but I think it just doesn't look as good as Phase 5. So I'm going to give it a D, and I'll tell you why. Have you ever seen the side of an Acela rail car? It's got like these weird blobs of like, there's some green even and like blue. It hasn't aged well at all. I think that the first gen Acelas for their time were great, but they again have overstayed their welcome and really haven't aged very well into the 2020s. Speaking of the 2020s though, the Acela 2 paint scheme really doesn't fare that much better in my opinion. For one, there's very little continuity between the power cars and the rail cars. The rail cars have these blue lines and then the white, and then the power cars just doesn't have that blue line on the bottom. It just cuts right to white. There's no transition or anything. I wish that they would fix that, but I don't think they will. It's a pretty modern looking paint scheme, but I think that the white on the front of the locomotive, or I guess power car, is not going to age very well, especially as it gets dirty. It's just going to start to look gray, and it's not nearly as eye-catching as Phase 6 and Phase 7. So, I don't know, between a C and a B, I think for the fact that this is a very modern paint scheme, and it looks good right now, it's going to get a B. Next up are three one-off, I guess you can say, or miscellaneous paint schemes that Amtrak has put onto their locomotives. We'll start with the Veterans paint scheme, which I think is really good. The era that it came about was during the Phase 5 era, and I think that the Veterans red, when put next to a conventional Phase 5 locomotive, is very eye-catching and it looks nice. I do think that the sides of the locomotives are a little bit busy and the logo is not the best, the Veterans logo, but it's a pretty good paint scheme, so I'm going to give it a B. With that said though, I do hope that they update it for Phase 6 and Phase 7, because if they ever do a Veterans ALC 42, which realistically they probably will, this exact paint scheme probably will not age very well. It's getting a little old, the silver's kind of on its way out. I think if they did more red, maybe like a dark gray, it would look a lot better. Next up is Midnight Blue, which Amtrak debuted in I believe 2020, maybe it was early 2021. It pays homage to Amtrak employees who work throughout the night to keep their trains running. I think Midnight Blue is pretty cool. It's all one color, but I like the color. It's nice. When the locomotive is dirty or in like overcast weather, I mean, I live in Massachusetts and this thing's on the lakeshore a lot, and it's always overcast here. It just doesn't look great, but that's more of a rail fan's point of view. I think as an actual paint scheme, it gets, I guess, a C. It's a lot of blue, and if you don't like that color, it's not a great looking engine. And yeah, it's always dirty, so it just doesn't look great. Next up is one of my least favorite special paint schemes on Amtrak, the Operation Lifesaver locomotive. I always thought that this thing was dark blue and yellow, but apparently it's black. It's just a very light black. I think that it plays a weird trick on your eyes where you, at least for me, I can't tell if it's blue or black. Also, the reflective red safety stripe kind of clashes with the yellow, so this one gets a D, especially after seeing it in person in Chicago. I can't be a fan. It doesn't look good. Anyways, on to Amtrak's 3 ad-wrapped locomotives that they've debuted on the Northeast Corridor. Now I know as of recording this, there's rumors that another one's on the way, and I'm sure when this video's out, that locomotive may have made its debut, or maybe about to make its debut, but for now, we just have these 3. I'm going to start with the King Tut unit. This one also gets a D. It looks very similar to the locomotive I just talked about, the Operation Lifesaver P42. it just doesn't look great. The color combination's not good, the red and the yellow clash, but this one's even worse. I think the hieroglyphics on it look cool when you're really close to it, but from a distance of more than maybe 10 feet, it makes the locomotive look dirty, even though it only was on the rails for like a couple months and then they took the wrap off. So it just looked odd on ACS 64. I feel like ACS 64s are always red, white, and blue. I've never seen one in a different color. So this one was just kind of off-putting. Next up is the Coca-Cola Red on 606. Well, this locomotive actually received both of these wraps, the King Tut and the Coca-Cola Wrap, but I think the Coca-Cola Wrap is a lot better. This one for me, it's gonna get an A because the red is extremely eye-catching. The polar bear on the side's pretty cute too, I like that. And it was very cool. It was the first ad-wrapped ACS 64, got everyone in the holiday spirit, and it was an exciting thing when it came out. And I'm glad they're doing these ad wraps more for the Northeast Corridor, even though it's just an ad. It's exciting, it's something different. So I like the 606 in Coca-Cola Wrap. I think the red is very eye-catching, and it was always just a good-looking locomotive. But we gotta end this with the best Amtrak ad wrap of all time, without a doubt, was 662. This one was great. It was sponsored by Train Sim World, so they knew what the rail fans wanted. So instead of just doing a Train Sim World like weird wrap, they made it a heritage unit for the rail fans, like a AEM7 tribute unit. It's an easy S. It looks fantastic. It stayed for a while. We had it for almost a year, I think it was. Like, it was great. I think the 662, best ad wrap. So, take a look at this. Here's our final tier list. I think it's a pretty good tier list. I mean, obviously it's my opinion, and I welcome you to make your own response video to this if you have different opinions. I'll post the link to this tier list I made in the description. But anyways, I think my favorite paint scheme of all these has to be Phase 6. I mean, it's still very fresh looking. It's very fresh in everyone's mind. So, right now, that's gotta be my favorite. We'll see how well it fares with time. Maybe I'll revert to having the original Phase 3. I know it's a basic choice, Phase 3 on the F40s, but you can't go wrong with it. It's such an iconic paint scheme. And for the worst, it's got to go to the King Tut one. I'm sorry, I know that there were a lot of people that liked this one. It was different, it was unique. I just can't get down with it. It doesn't look good, but I'd love to see what you guys think. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon in a more normal scripted video.